There are moments in the spiritual life when a single choice, made quietly and without much thought, can determine the direction of an entire season. And the beginning of the year is one of those moments because it is not merely a change in calendar, but a threshold, a spiritual doorway that you step through, whether you are aware of it or not. And Padre Pio understood this reality with frightening clarity. For he often warned that the enemy does not wait until people are strong and alert, but attacks precisely when they believe everything is starting fresh and therefore harmless. And this is why the first days of the year carry a weight that most people completely underestimate. Because what you welcome in at the start does not remain isolated. It establishes patterns, sets tones, and silently shapes what follows. And this is especially true of the things you choose to bring into your home, into your daily rhythm, and into your inner life. Because a home is never neutral ground in the spiritual sense. It is either being consecrated or being compromised, either ordered toward God or slowly cluttered with things that pull the heart away from Him. And Padre Pio insisted that many people block their own blessings at the very beginning of the year, not through great sins or dramatic rebellions, but through small, careless decisions that appear innocent but carry hidden consequences. And this is where his warning becomes uncomfortable, because it forces us to admit that not everything marketed as new, fresh, or beneficial is actually good for the soul, and that not every purchase is simply material, because intention, symbolism, and attention all leave a spiritual imprint, and the beginning of the year magnifies that imprint, as if the soil were freshly turned, and whatever is planted first takes root more deeply than anything added later. And this is why Padre Pio spoke so often about guarding the first steps, the first days, the first movements of the heart, because once the direction is set, it becomes harder to change course without pain. And many people only realize this months later, when they feel stuck, restless, spiritually dry, wondering why their prayers feel empty and their peace fragile, without ever connecting those symptoms to the quiet choices made when the year was young. And this blindness is not accidental, because the enemy rarely presents himself as obvious danger, but prefers to appear reasonable, attractive, discounted, and convenient, offering objects, habits, and distractions that promise comfort, productivity, or pleasure, while slowly dulling spiritual sensitivity. And Padre Pio called this one of the devil's most effective strategies, to disguise traps as blessings and chains as conveniences, especially at moments when people are focused on external change rather than interior vigilance. And this is why the first purchases of the year matter so much, because they are often made with excitement, hope, and lowered discernment. And when discernment is lowered, invitation is extended, whether consciously or not. And the spiritual realm responds not to our explanations, but to our openness, not to what we say we believe, but to what we actually make room for. And this is a truth that modern culture resists fiercely, because it prefers to treat objects as neutral and choices as isolated. But Padre Pio knew that neutrality is an illusion, because everything either draws the heart toward God or away from Him, even if the movement is subtle. And subtle movements repeated daily become habits, and habits become spiritual climates, and climates eventually determine fruit. And this is why the beginning of the year should be treated with reverence rather than consumption, with prayer rather than impulse, because it belongs to God in a special way, not because of superstition, but because beginnings reveal priorities, and priorities shape destinies. And if you are listening to this, and something inside you feels unsettled, that is not fear, it is awareness, because awareness is often uncomfortable before it becomes liberating. And Padre Pio never sought to frighten people, but he refused to soothe them with half-truths, because he knew that false peace at the beginning of a journey leads to greater turmoil later on. And so he urged souls to slow down, to question not only what they were buying, but why they were buying it, and what they hoped it would give them that God had not yet given. Because restlessness often disguises itself as necessity, and anxiety often dresses itself as preparation, and the first days of the year expose these inner movements more clearly than any other time, And this is why guarding them matters so deeply. And if this reflection is resonating with you, take a moment to subscribe to this channel, because this space exists for those who want to live their faith consciously rather than reactively, and to walk through the year awake rather than distracted. And the warning Padre Pio left is not about fear of objects, but about responsibility for thresholds, because every threshold crossed without prayer becomes a vulnerability, and every threshold crossed with intention becomes a protection. And the tragedy is that many people cross the most important threshold of the year distracted, rushed, and spiritually unguarded, filling their homes with noise, symbols, and emotional residue without ever asking whether these things serve their soul or simply occupy it. And once that occupation takes place, the soul becomes crowded, and a crowded soul struggles to hear God, not because God has stopped speaking, but because silence has been replaced with stimulation. And this replacement often begins with what seems like harmless upgrading, refreshing, or rewarding oneself at the start of the year. And Padre Pio warned that when the heart is not anchored, it seeks anchors in things, and those anchors eventually weigh it down. And this is why the question that should guide every beginning is not, what do I want to add, but what do I need to protect? Because protection precedes growth, and consecration precedes blessing, and a year built on guarded beginnings stands on solid ground, while a year built on impulse stands on shifting sand. And this is not about rejecting the world, but about ordering it correctly, placing God first, not symbolically but practically, in decisions that cost something, including restraint, patience, and discernment. And Padre Pio lived this truth with radical simplicity, not because objects are evil, but because space belongs to God before it belongs to anything else. And the invitation here is the same, to begin the year awake, intentional, and spiritually alert, not fearing what you buy, but understanding what you invite, and in doing so, to choose a path where peace is not something you chase later, but something you protect from the very first step. What Padre Pio wanted souls to understand is that the spiritual life is shaped less by dramatic moments and more by what we repeatedly allow to occupy our space. And this is why he paid such close attention to homes, rooms, objects, and habits. Because a home is not merely a shelter for the body, but an environment that forms the soul. And when the year is new and the heart is open, whatever is placed within that environment begins to educate the spirit silently, patiently, without argument. And this is why symbols matter far more than modern thinking is comfortable admitting, because symbols speak to the deeper layers of the human person, where reason does not argue and conscience does not debate. And Padre Pio warned that objects carrying meanings contrary to the faith, even when purchased innocently or for aesthetic reasons, begin to reorder a home in ways that slowly weaken spiritual clarity, not through sudden darkness, but through subtle confusion. Because when Christ is no longer clearly at the center, something else inevitably takes his place, even if that something appears decorative, cultural, or harmless. And this is why Padre Pio insisted that nothing in a Christian home should rival the light of Christ, not because he believed objects had magical power, but because he understood that the human heart responds to what it sees repeatedly, and what the eyes encounter daily eventually shapes desire, attention, and trust. And when unfamiliar symbols enter the home without discernment, they quietly introduce other narratives about meaning, power, protection, and fulfillment that do not come from God. And this is especially dangerous at the beginning of the year, because that is when people are consciously or unconsciously asking the question of direction, even if they do not phrase it that way. And when direction is being sought, influences gain strength. And Padre Pio often spoke of how easily people invited confusion into their lives by treating spiritual symbolism as mere decoration, forgetting that every tradition encodes its worldview into its symbols, and those worldviews do not peacefully coexist inside the soul, because the heart cannot serve two foundations without experiencing tension, restlessness, and eventual fragmentation. And this is why people often feel unsettled without knowing why, sensing a heaviness or distraction they cannot explain, because the soul recognizes dissonance long before the mind gives it language. And when Padre Pio encountered souls burdened by unexplained anxiety, dryness in prayer, or sudden loss of peace, he often traced it not to dramatic sin but to small openings that had been left unattended, objects accepted as gifts without discernment, decorations brought home from travels without prayer, items chosen because they were fashionable rather than because they were spiritually coherent. And each of these choices seemed insignificant on its own. But together they formed a pattern of spiritual negligence, and negligence always weakens defenses, and weakened defenses invite influence, and influence eventually shapes behavior, and this chain rarely announces itself loudly, which is why it is so effective. And Padre Pio warned that the enemy prefers slow erosion to open confrontation, because erosion feels natural and unthreatening, and people rarely fight what they do not recognize as a threat. And this is why he urged souls to examine their homes honestly, not with fear, but with responsibility, asking whether what surrounded them pointed the heart toward God or subtly distracted it. And this examination becomes even more important at the beginning of the year, because what you normalize in January becomes familiar by March and invisible by June. And invisibility is the enemy's greatest ally, because once something is invisible, it is no longer questioned, and when it is no longer questioned, it begins to govern quietly. And Padre Pio knew that spiritual governance does not require consent, only access, and access is granted when vigilance fades. And this is why the call is not to panic or purge impulsively, but to slow down, pray, and discern intentionally, because discernment restores clarity, and clarity restores peace, and peace is not merely an emotion, but a sign of right order. And right order allows grace to flow freely, and when grace flows freely, the soul grows resilient, focused, and capable of resisting distraction. And if this reflection is helping you see your space differently, consider subscribing, because this channel exists to help you cultivate a faith that is lived consciously, not passively, and that resists compromise without becoming anxious. And Padre Pio's wisdom is not about suspicion of the world, but about responsibility for thresholds, because thresholds determine what enters and what remains outside. And when a home is treated as sacred space rather than neutral territory, decisions become simpler, not harder, because the guiding question shifts from desire to coherence, from impulse to alignment, and alignment brings stability, and stability supports prayer, and prayer anchors everything else. And this is why Padre Pio emphasized that holiness does not begin with heroic acts, but with faithful order. And faithful order is established through daily choices that honor God's place at the center. And when the year begins with such choices, the soul is strengthened quietly, prepared to face challenges without losing balance, because it is not carrying unnecessary weight. And unnecessary weight is what tires the soul most quickly, not suffering itself, but clutter, confusion, and divided attention. And Padre Pio wanted souls to be light enough to follow God wherever he led, and that lightness begins by guarding what enters the home, the mind, and the heart, especially when everything feels new and full of possibility. Because possibility without discernment becomes vulnerability, but possibility guided by prayer becomes blessing, and this distinction defines the difference between a year that slowly drains the spirit and a year that, even in hardship, remains grounded, peaceful, and oriented toward God. Padre Pio also spoke with unusual clarity about another danger that quietly takes root at the beginning of the year, a danger far more common today than in his lifetime, yet perfectly aligned with what he warned about decades ago. And this danger is not evil in itself, but becomes destructive through excess and misplaced priority, because it steals something far more precious than time. It steals interior silence, and silence is the soil where faith grows. And without silence, the soul becomes restless, scattered, incapable of depth. And Padre Pio understood that the enemy does not need to destroy faith outright if he can simply keep the soul permanently distracted, because a distracted soul rarely sins dramatically, but slowly forgets how to pray, how to listen, how to remain present before God. And this forgetting is far more effective than open rebellion, because it happens without resistance. And this is why Padre Pio warned about filling one's life with noise, stimulation, and constant external input, especially at moments when the soul should be setting its direction. And the beginning of the year is precisely such a moment, because habits formed early tend to solidify quickly, and what you normalize in January often governs the rest of the year without further deliberation. And Padre Pio saw that when people began the year by purchasing objects that increased distraction, dependence, and mental noise, they were unknowingly choosing a path of spiritual fragmentation, not because the objects were sinful, but because they trained the soul away from recollection, and recollection is essential for any serious spiritual life. And without it, prayer becomes mechanical, shallow, and eventually abandoned. And Padre Pio often said that God speaks softly, not because he lacks power, but because he respects freedom, and a soul that is constantly stimulated cannot hear a voice that does not shout. And this is why silence feels uncomfortable to many people today, because they have trained themselves to avoid it, and avoidance of silence is often avoidance of the self, and avoidance of the self eventually becomes avoidance of God. And Padre Pio recognized this pattern long before smartphones and endless feeds existed, because the human heart has always sought escape from interior stillness when it fears what it might encounter there, and distraction offers a perfect refuge from uncomfortable truth, unresolved wounds, and unanswered questions. And this is why purchases that increase distraction are spiritually dangerous at the beginning of the year, because they set the tone for avoidance rather than engagement. And engagement is where conversion happens. And Padre Pio saw many souls who sincerely wanted to grow closer to God, but kept filling their lives with noise that made such growth impossible. And they would wonder why prayer felt dry, why peace was elusive, why God seemed distant, not realizing that distance was not imposed by God, but created by constant interruption. And the soul cannot deepen when it is never allowed to settle. And Padre Pio often compared the soul to water, saying that when water is constantly agitated, it cannot reflect anything clearly, but when it becomes still, it reflects the sky. And this metaphor captures something essential about the spiritual life, because clarity does not come from effort alone, but from stillness, and stillness cannot survive in an environment saturated with distraction. And this is why beginning the year by adding more screens, more stimulation, more reasons to avoid quiet moments can quietly undermine the soul's capacity to receive grace. And grace does not force itself upon a distracted heart. It waits patiently, sometimes indefinitely, until space is made. And space is not made by acquiring more, but by choosing less. And this choice feels countercultural, even uncomfortable, because modern life equates fullness with constant engagement. But Padre Pio knew that spiritual fullness often requires deliberate restraint, and restraint is not repression but freedom, because what you are not enslaved to cannot control you. And control is what distraction ultimately seeks, not through malice but through habit. And habits formed early are difficult to dismantle later, which is why Padre Pio urged vigilance at beginnings, whether of a year, a relationship, or a new phase of life, because beginnings establish patterns that quietly persist. And this vigilance does not require fear but awareness, asking whether a purchase serves your vocation or distracts from it, whether it supports prayer or undermines it, whether it creates space for God or fills that space with noise. And these questions are rarely asked at the moment of purchase, because purchasing is often impulsive, emotional, and reactive. And this is precisely why the enemy prefers temptation disguised as convenience, because convenience bypasses reflection. And Padre Pio warned that anything that consistently pulls you away from prayer, reflection, and presence eventually weakens your spiritual immune system, leaving you vulnerable, not through sin, but through exhaustion. Because an exhausted soul rarely resists temptation effectively, and this exhaustion often masquerades as normal life, busy schedules, constant connectivity, and endless input, all of which are socially approved and rarely questioned. And yet Padre Pio saw their cumulative effect clearly, because he spent hours each day in silence, prayer, and contemplation, and he knew from experience that spiritual strength is not generated by activity, but by communion. And communion requires attention, and attention cannot exist in a state of perpetual distraction. And if this reflection resonates with you, consider subscribing, because this channel exists to help you recover a faith that is lived intentionally rather than consumed passively. And Padre Pio's message here is not a rejection of technology or modern life, but a call to hierarchy, because when tools become masters, the soul suffers, and when priorities are inverted, peace disappears. And the beginning of the year offers a rare opportunity to reorder priorities consciously before habits harden and momentum takes over. And this reordering does not require dramatic renunciation, but honest evaluation, asking whether what you are bringing into your life will help you hear God more clearly or drown him out more effectively. And this question alone can transform how you approach not only purchases, but time itself. Because time filled with noise feels full but leaves the soul empty, while time guarded for silence may feel sparse but becomes rich. And Padre Pio understood that the enemy fears silence more than activity, because silence allows truth to surface, wounds to heal, and grace to work. And this is why distraction is such a powerful strategy, because it keeps the soul perpetually occupied without ever being fulfilled. And when the year begins under such conditions, the soul may move quickly, but not deeply, achieving much, but becoming little. And Padre Pio wanted souls not merely to function, but to be transformed. And transformation requires encounter, and encounter requires presence, and presence requires silence, and silence must be chosen, protected, and defended, especially at moments when the world is encouraging you to fill every gap with noise, because what you protect at the beginning often protects you throughout, and what you neglect early often demands a higher cost later. And Padre Pio's warning is ultimately an invitation, not to fear what you buy, but to understand what you are becoming through your choices, because every choice trains the soul in a certain direction, and the beginning of the year is when that training begins anew, whether consciously or not. And choosing wisely here does not guarantee an easy year, but it does create a soul capable of navigating difficulty without losing its center, because its center has been guarded, not crowded out. And that is the quiet strength Padre Pio wanted for every soul entrusted to his care. Padre Pio also warned about a third danger that often goes unnoticed because it hides behind good intentions and emotional justification. And this danger is not found on store shelves in an obvious form, but enters the home through the heart, because it is not the object itself that carries the weight, but the intention with which it is acquired. And Padre Pio insisted repeatedly that intention shapes the spiritual imprint of every action, especially actions made at threshold moments. And the beginning of the year is one of the most powerful thresholds in human life, because it is when people unconsciously declare what they believe will save them, comfort them, or define them in the months ahead. And Padre Pio saw that many people begin the year carrying unresolved wounds, resentments, fears, and insecurities, and instead of bringing these to God, they attempt to soothe them through acquisition, through buying something that promises relief, validation, or control. And this is where the danger lies, because what is bought to heal a wound without God often becomes a container for that wound, and the object itself becomes charged with the emotional state that produced it. And this charge does not fade with time. It lingers quietly, shaping the atmosphere of the home and the inner life of the person who brought it there. And Padre Pio understood this deeply because he could perceive not only actions, but the spiritual residue left behind by motivations. And he often told penitents that the same action could either bless or burden the soul, depending entirely on why it was done. And this is especially true with purchases made from pride, comparison, resentment, fear, or wounded ego, because these emotions are not neutral. They are openings, and when you act from them, you reinforce them, and reinforcement is how spiritual patterns take root. And the beginning of the year is when patterns are most easily established, because the soul is in a state of openness, expectation, and vulnerability. And Padre Pio saw many people who sincerely wanted a better year, but unknowingly filled the first days with choices driven by inner unrest rather than trust. And this unrest does not disappear once the purchase is complete. It simply changes form, becoming a subtle dissatisfaction that follows the person wherever they go. And Padre Pio often said that peace cannot be purchased, because peace is not the result of possession, but of alignment with God's will. And when purchases are made to prove something, to compete, to compensate, or to numb pain, they move the soul further out of alignment, not closer to it. And the tragedy is that these purchases often feel justified, even necessary, because modern culture constantly reinforces the idea that self-expression through consumption is healthy, empowering, and healing. But Padre Pio saw the opposite effect repeatedly. People who filled their homes with symbols of success while their souls remained restless. People who upgraded their lives externally while their interior life grew increasingly empty. And he knew that this emptiness was not caused by lack, but by misdirected desire, because desire is meant to draw the soul toward God, not toward endless substitutes. And substitutes always disappoint because they promise what they cannot deliver, and this disappointment accumulates quietly, creating a background noise of dissatisfaction that becomes normalized over time, and the soul forgets what true peace feels like, mistaking constant stimulation for fulfillment. And Padre Pio warned that this kind of life slowly erodes gratitude, because gratitude thrives in simplicity and clarity, not in excess and comparison. And when gratitude fades, resentment often takes its place. Resentment toward others who seem to have more, toward circumstances that feel unfair, toward God who appears silent. And this resentment further poisons intention, creating a cycle that becomes difficult to break once established. And the beginning of the year is precisely when this cycle can either be interrupted or reinforced. And Padre Pio urged people to examine not only what they were bringing into their homes, but why, asking whether a purchase was an act of stewardship or an act of escape, because escape rarely leads to freedom. It only postpones confrontation with the truth. And truth is what heals, and truth requires courage, and courage often feels uncomfortable, which is why distraction and consumption are so appealing, because they offer immediate relief without demanding interior change. But Padre Pio knew that relief without change is temporary, and temporary solutions eventually demand repetition, more purchases, more upgrades, more attempts to fill the same void. And this is how people become enslaved to patterns they never consciously chose. And slavery of this kind does not look dramatic. It looks normal, socially acceptable, even successful. And yet the soul feels increasingly heavy, increasingly tired, increasingly distant from God. And Padre Pio saw this heaviness as a sign not of failure, but of misdirection, because the soul was trying to live on substitutes rather than nourishment. And nourishment comes from God alone. And when the soul stops seeking nourishment from its true source, it becomes malnourished, no matter how much it consumes. And this malnourishment manifests as irritability, anxiety, comparison, and spiritual dryness. And people often respond to these symptoms by purchasing even more, hoping the next thing will finally bring relief, and the cycle deepens. And Padre Pio's guidance here is radically simple but profoundly challenging. He urged people to pause before acting on emotional impulses, especially at beginnings, and to ask whether their desire was rooted in trust or fear, gratitude or resentment, freedom or comparison, because fear-driven choices contract the soul, while trust-driven choices expand it, and expansion is where grace flows, and contraction is where it stagnates, and stagnation is spiritually dangerous, not because it is dramatic, but because it feels normal, and the soul slowly forgets what it was created for. And if this reflection is speaking to you, take a moment to like and subscribe, because this channel exists to help uncover these subtle but decisive spiritual dynamics that rarely get discussed openly. And Padre Pio's wisdom here is not about moralizing purchases, but about reclaiming intentionality, because intentionality is how the soul remains awake, and an awake soul is difficult to deceive, and deception is what thrives in unconscious habits. And the beginning of the year is when habits are most easily examined because they have not yet solidified. And this examination requires honesty, not perfection. Because Padre Pio never demanded perfection, he demanded sincerity before God, acknowledging wounds rather than hiding them behind possessions, bringing pain to prayer rather than to the marketplace, and allowing God to heal what no object ever could. And this healing does not always feel immediate, but it is real, and real healing produces peace rather than temporary excitement. And peace does not depend on circumstances, which is why Padre Pio valued it so highly. And he knew that peace cultivated at the beginning of the year becomes a refuge throughout it, because storms will come, regardless of how carefully one plans. But a soul anchored in peace can endure storms without losing direction, and that direction is ultimately what matters, because life is not judged by accumulation, but by orientation, where the soul is facing, what it is moving toward, and what it is willing to release in order to remain free. And Padre Pio believed deeply that freedom is not found in having more, but in needing less, especially less validation, less comparison, less escape. And the beginning of the year offers a sacred opportunity to choose this freedom deliberately, not through dramatic gestures, but through quiet decisions that honor intention over impulse, truth over comfort, and God over substitutes. And when these decisions are made early, they shape the year, not by eliminating difficulty, but by ensuring that difficulty does not derail the soul from its true purpose, which is communion with God. And communion is the only thing that ultimately satisfies, because everything else eventually passes, leaving behind either gratitude or regret. And Padre Pio wanted souls to arrive at the end of their journey, lighter, not heavier, freer, not more burdened. And that journey begins again every year, whether we recognize it or not, with the choices we make when the door is first opened. Padre Pio's warning did not end with what people bring into their homes, because he knew that objects are only the visible surface of a much deeper struggle, and that struggle is about authority, about who governs the rhythm of a life and sets its direction. And this is why he insisted that the beginning of the year is not neutral time, but claimed time, time that will either be governed by God or quietly occupied by competing forces. And Padre Pio observed that many people unknowingly surrender authority over their year through habits that seem harmless but slowly reshape priorities, dull spiritual sensitivity, and weaken the will. And these habits often arrive disguised as comfort, efficiency, or productivity, but their effect is erosion, not growth, because they fragment attention and scatter desire. And a scattered soul is easily led, easily distracted, easily exhausted. And Padre Pio saw exhaustion not merely as physical fatigue, but as spiritual depletion, the kind that leaves a person functioning but no longer alive inside. And he traced much of this depletion to how people structured their days, especially at the start of the year, when routines are formed, reinforced, and normalized. And he warned that routines created without prayer quickly become prisons because they operate on impulse rather than intention. And impulse is reactive while intention is rooted, and rootedness is what sustains faith through difficulty. And Padre Pio insisted that a year cannot be holy by accident, it must be claimed deliberately. Because holiness does not drift into a life, it is chosen, defended, and cultivated through daily acts of alignment with God. And this alignment begins not with grand resolutions, but with small, consistent acts that orient the soul towards silence, obedience, and trust. And he noticed that people who began the year by filling every moment with activity, noise, and stimulation often found themselves spiritually empty by spring, even if externally successful. And this emptiness did not come from doing too much, but from doing too much without God. And Padre Pio often reminded people that even good things can become obstacles when they replace prayer rather than flow from it. And the danger is subtle, because productivity is praised while contemplation is dismissed as unproductive. And yet Padre Pio knew that contemplation is what gives meaning to action, because without contemplation, action becomes frantic, self-referential, and ultimately unsatisfying. And he warned that the enemy does not always tempt people toward obvious sin, but often toward constant busyness, because a busy soul has no time to listen, no time to examine itself, and no time to notice when it is drifting. And drift is spiritually dangerous precisely because it feels effortless. And Padre Pio saw drift as one of the most common reasons people felt blocked, because they were no longer choosing their direction. They were being carried by momentum they did not consciously set. And the beginning of the year is when momentum is established, which is why he urged people to guard the first weeks carefully, not by doing more, but by doing less with greater awareness. Because awareness restores agency, and agency is how the soul cooperates with grace, and grace cannot force itself into a life cluttered with constant distraction, because God respects freedom, and freedom requires space, interior space that is not filled with noise, screens, and endless demands. And Padre Pio often said that God speaks in silence, not because he is weak, but because silence honors freedom. And a soul that cannot tolerate silence has already surrendered some measure of its freedom, because it relies on stimulation to regulate its inner state. And this reliance becomes a form of dependency that weakens spiritual resilience. And Padre Pio observed that people who avoided silence often feared what would surface in it: unresolved grief, guilt, doubt, or longing. And instead of facing these realities with God, they anesthetized themselves with activity. And this avoidance did not heal the wound, it buried it. And buried wounds do not disappear, they fester, shaping behavior from beneath the surface. And this is why Padre Pio emphasized confession, examination of conscience, and regular prayer as non-negotiable foundations for a healthy spiritual life, especially at the beginning of the year, because these practices bring buried realities into the light. And light is what heals, and healing restores clarity, and clarity restores peace, and peace restores strength. And Padre Pio saw strength not as dominance or control, but as the capacity to remain faithful under pressure. And this capacity is built slowly through daily discipline rather than sudden inspiration. And discipline requires boundaries, and boundaries require saying no. And saying no is increasingly difficult in a culture that equates availability with value. And Padre Pio warned that when a person never says no, their life becomes governed by external demands rather than interior conviction. And this governance slowly displaces God from the center, not through rebellion, but through neglect. And neglect is often more spiritually damaging than overt rejection, because it is harder to recognize and therefore harder to correct. And the beginning of the year is when neglect can either be confronted or entrenched. And Padre Pio urged people to confront it early by reclaiming the first moments of the day for God, because the first moments shape the tone of everything that follows. And he believed deeply in offering the day to God before engaging with the world, not as a pious gesture, but as a declaration of authority, a way of saying that God governs this life, not circumstance, not impulse, not fear. And people who practiced this consistently found that even when the day became chaotic, something remained stable within them, and that stability allowed them to respond rather than react. And reaction is where mistakes multiply, while response flows from discernment. and discernment requires interior stillness, and stillness must be protected intentionally, especially in the early days of the year when habits are still fluid. And Padre Pio warned that once a habit is established, it becomes increasingly difficult to change because habits bypass conscious decision-making, operating automatically. And automatic living is spiritually dangerous because it removes the soul from active participation in its own formation. And formation is the essence of the Christian life, being shaped gradually into greater likeness to Christ. And this shaping does not occur passively. It requires cooperation, and cooperation requires attention, and attention is one of the most contested resources of modern life, which is why Padre Pio's guidance feels increasingly urgent, because the forces competing for attention have multiplied, and without deliberate resistance, attention is fragmented beyond recovery, leaving the soul exhausted but unsatisfied. And if this reflection is helping you see your own patterns more clearly, take a moment to subscribe and stay connected, because this channel exists to support intentional living rooted in faith rather than reaction. And Padre Pio's wisdom here is not about rejecting modern life, but about engaging it from a place of interior freedom. Because freedom is not the absence of obligation, but the ability to choose rightly, even under pressure. And the beginning of the year is a gift, precisely because it offers a pause, a moment when the past loosens its grip and the future has not yet demanded compliance. And in that pause, the soul can choose again, can reorient, can reclaim ground lost through neglect or distraction. And Padre Pio believed that God honors these moments of sincere return more than any external achievement, because they reflect humility, and humility is the soil where grace grows most abundantly. And grace is what carries the soul when effort fails, which it inevitably will. And this is why Padre Pio never placed ultimate trust in human strength or willpower, but always pointed back to grace, because grace does not exhaust itself. And a life anchored in grace may stumble, but it does not collapse. And the beginning of the year is when that anchor can be reset, strengthened, and secured, not through fear of making mistakes, but through trust that God desires to guide more than we desire to be guided. And when that trust is chosen early, the year unfolds differently, not necessarily easier, but clearer, steadier, and more deeply rooted in purpose that does not fade when circumstances change. And that purpose is communion with God, which remains the only foundation that does not shift with time. Padre Pio's warnings about the beginning of the year reached their deepest point when he spoke about protection, because he understood that protection is not superstition, not fear, and not obsession with evil, but alignment with God's order. And when that order is respected, protection follows naturally, while when it is ignored, vulnerability increases, even without obvious sin. And Padre Pio saw that many people asked for protection while continuing to live in ways that dismantled it piece by piece. And this contradiction created confusion, anxiety, and a sense of being blocked, because they wanted God's shelter without God's structure. And Padre Pio was uncompromising on this point. He taught that protection is not something you ask for once and forget. It is something you maintain through choices, habits, and obedience, especially at the beginning of the year when spiritual boundaries are being drawn. And he often said that a house without spiritual order becomes like a city without walls, not because God abandons it, but because it has removed its own defenses. And these defenses are not magical objects or formulas, but humility, prayer, sacramental life, and discipline. And when these are weak or inconsistent, the soul becomes exposed, and exposure does not always result in immediate disaster. Sometimes it results in slow erosion, a gradual loss of peace, clarity, and strength that people cannot explain. And Padre Pio identified this erosion as one of the enemy's preferred strategies, because it rarely alarms the conscience until the damage is advanced. And this is why he emphasized guarding the start of the year so intensely, because early negligence multiplies over time, while early vigilance compounds into stability. And he taught that spiritual protection begins with consecration, not in a dramatic sense, but in a practical one, consciously placing one's life, home, work, and intentions under God's authority. And he encouraged people to do this explicitly, because clarity strengthens resolve, and resolve sustains fidelity when emotions fluctuate. And Padre Pio knew emotions are unreliable guides, especially in modern life where stimulation distorts perception, and he warned that relying on feeling protected rather than living protected was a dangerous mistake, because protection is often invisible, noticed only by its absence when it is gone. And he explained that many spiritual attacks do not come as sudden crises, but as subtle invitations to compromise, fatigue, or discouragement. And when a soul is already disordered, these invitations find easy access. But when a soul is ordered, they encounter resistance, not through effort, but through alignment. And alignment simplifies discernment, because when life is oriented toward God, choices become clearer and confusion diminishes. And Padre Pio often told people that confusion is rarely from God, because God clarifies while the enemy obscures. And this obscuring often happens through excess information, excess commitments, excess consumption, excess concern with appearances. And Padre Pio saw excess as a spiritual anesthetic, something that numbs awareness and weakens resistance, and he urged people to begin the year by reducing rather than adding, simplifying rather than expanding, because simplicity restores sensitivity, and sensitivity is essential for spiritual health. And he practiced this himself rigorously, living with minimal possessions, not as a rejection of material reality, but as a way of preserving interior freedom. And he warned that possessions easily become anchors, tying the heart to anxiety, comparison, and fear of loss, especially when they are acquired impulsively or for emotional reasons. And he observed that many people filled their homes with objects, but starved their souls of stillness. And this imbalance created restlessness that no purchase could satisfy, and restlessness, when unaddressed, becomes vulnerability, because it seeks relief rather than truth, and relief often comes at the cost of clarity. And Padre Pio insisted that true peace is not the absence of discomfort, but the presence of God. And this presence is cultivated, not consumed, and cultivated through daily fidelity to prayer, confession, and the sacraments, which he called the true walls of protection around a soul. And he warned that when people neglected these practices, even while calling themselves believers, they became spiritually exposed. And exposure does not always manifest as obvious temptation. Sometimes it manifests as weariness, cynicism, or loss of hope. And Padre Pio recognized despair as one of the most dangerous states, because it paralyzes the will and blinds the soul to grace. And he traced much despair back to lives lived without spiritual rhythm, where prayer was sporadic and reactive rather than regular and intentional. And he taught that rhythm is protective because it creates predictability in the spiritual life, and predictability builds resilience, and resilience is what carries a soul through seasons of dryness or trial. And the beginning of the year is when rhythm is established, which is why Padre Pio urged people to choose a prayer routine they could sustain rather than one that impressed them temporarily, because unsustainable practices breed guilt and abandonment, while modest, faithful practices build confidence and continuity. And he warned against spiritual ambition detached from humility, because ambition seeks extraordinary experiences, while humility seeks consistency, and consistency transforms the soul quietly but profoundly. And Padre Pio often said that the enemy fears humble fidelity more than dramatic gestures, because humble fidelity resists over time, and time is where victory is decided. And he saw many people begin the year with enthusiasm only to abandon their commitments by mid-year, not because they lacked desire, but because they lacked structure. And structure is not rigidity, it is support. Like bones support the body, and without structure, even strong muscles collapse. And Padre Pio emphasized that spiritual structure includes guarding what enters the mind as well as the home, because thoughts shape perception, and perception shapes response. And he warned that constant exposure to negativity, fear-driven news, or content that mocks faith weakens spiritual defenses, even if consumed passively. And he encouraged people to be selective, not out of fear, but out of respect for their own interior life, because the soul cannot thrive on poison, even in small doses. And the beginning of the year is when people often reset their media habits, and Padre Pio would urge them to do so consciously, asking whether what they consume strengthens faith or undermines it. And he believed that the soul knows the answer if it listens honestly, and honesty is essential for protection, because self-deception creates blind spots, and blind spots are where vulnerability hides. And Padre Pio was relentless in exposing self-deception, not to condemn, but to heal, because healing begins with truth, and truth restores alignment, and alignment restores protection. And he reminded people that God does not desire to catch them unguarded, but to shelter them, and that shelter is always available, but it must be entered freely. And entering it requires letting go of habits, objects, and patterns that contradict God's order. And this letting go is often uncomfortable because it feels like loss. But Padre Pio insisted it is always preparation for greater freedom. And if this reflection is helping you reconsider how you structure your life, take a moment to subscribe, because these teachings are meant to be lived gradually, not consumed once and forgotten. And Padre Pio's final emphasis regarding protection was trust, because fear-driven vigilance exhausts the soul, while trust anchored in obedience strengthens it. And he taught that when a person sincerely strives to live in God's order, they need not obsess over danger, because God's grace covers what human awareness cannot. And this trust does not excuse negligence. It completes responsibility, allowing the soul to rest while remaining attentive. And the beginning of the year is when this balance can be restored. Vigilance without anxiety, discipline without rigidity, trust without passivity. And Padre Pio believed that a year begun this way unfolds under God's guidance, even when unforeseen trials arise. Because guidance is not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of direction. And direction prevents loss of meaning, which is what truly destroys people. And when meaning is preserved, suffering can be endured without collapse. And this endurance is the ultimate form of protection, because it keeps the soul oriented toward God, regardless of circumstances. And that orientation, once established, carries a person through the entire year and beyond, rooted not in fear of what might happen, but in confidence in the one who governs all things. Padre Pio's final insistence regarding the beginning of the year focused on one reality that most people underestimate, but that he considered decisive: coherence between belief and daily life, because he saw clearly that nothing weakens a soul faster than contradiction. And many people unknowingly live divided lives, professing faith with their lips while organizing their time, money, habits, and homes according to entirely different priorities. And this inner division creates spiritual leakage, a slow draining of strength that leaves a person exhausted without understanding why. And Padre Pio often told penitents that God does not demand perfection, but he does demand sincerity, because sincerity allows grace to work while duplicity blocks it. And he explained that the beginning of the year exposes this issue sharply, because resolutions reveal what we actually value, not what we claim to value. And he observed that many people promise God prayer, obedience, and trust, while simultaneously planning lives that leave no room for silence, sacrifice, or restraint. And this contradiction produces frustration, because grace is invited verbally but rejected structurally. And Padre Pio was direct about this, telling people that if God is not given real space, he will not force himself into the margins. And that space is created not by words but by choices, repeated daily, especially in the first weeks of the year when habits are being set. And he warned that habits formed early become defaults later, and defaults shape destiny more than intentions. And he urged people to examine their defaults honestly, how they begin their day, how they end it, what they turn to first when anxious, what they use to numb discomfort. And he insisted that whatever a person turns to reflexively becomes their true refuge, whether they call it that or not. And if that refuge is not God, then faith slowly becomes ornamental rather than functional, and ornamental faith cannot sustain a soul under pressure. And Padre Pio saw this collapse repeatedly. People who believed sincerely but lived inconsistently, and when trials came, their faith felt hollow because it had never been integrated into the structure of their lives. And he emphasized that integration is what protects faith, aligning thought, action, and intention, so that the soul moves in one direction rather than pulling itself apart. And this integration requires renunciation, because not everything can coexist with a life oriented toward God. And Padre Pio rejected the modern idea that balance means accommodating everything. Instead, he taught that balance means ordering everything, placing each thing in its proper place, with God first. And when God is first, other things find their measure. But when God is treated as one interest among many, everything becomes disordered. And this disorder manifests as anxiety, restlessness, and spiritual confusion, which Padre Pio recognized as symptoms rather than causes, pointing back to misplaced priorities. And he urged people to simplify their lives deliberately, not by rejecting responsibilities, but by removing excess that distracted from essential duties. And he taught that simplicity clarifies conscience, because when life is cluttered, conscience is drowned out. And without conscience, discernment fails. And without discernment, choices drift. And drifting is how people end up far from where they intended to go, without noticing the journey. And Padre Pio warned that drift is more dangerous than rebellion, because rebellion at least recognizes conflict, while drift anesthetizes awareness. And many spiritual losses occur not through dramatic sin, but through gradual neglect, prayer shortened, confession postponed, silence replaced with noise, sacrifice avoided. And these small concessions accumulate, and by mid-year, a person feels spiritually depleted without understanding why. And Padre Pio traced this depletion back to unguarded beginnings. And he insisted that guarding the beginning of the year was not superstition but wisdom, because beginnings establish direction, and direction determines outcome over time. And he often used the image of a river, saying that if the source is polluted, everything downstream is affected, no matter how pure the water appears later. And the source of the year is its first intentions and practices. And if those are compromised, the entire year bears the consequences. And Padre Pio urged people to consecrate not only their goals but their means, because he saw that many people ask God to bless ends achieved through disordered means, and this creates inner conflict, because grace does not cooperate with injustice or dishonesty. And when people pursue success, comfort, or security through means that violate conscience, they experience spiritual tension that no achievement resolves. And Padre Pio told them that peace cannot coexist with compromise, because peace flows from alignment with truth, not from outcomes. And he warned against rationalization, which he called the enemy's favorite language, because it allows a person to feel justified while remaining disobedient, and rationalization weakens conscience gradually until sin no longer alarms. And once alarm is gone, correction becomes difficult. And Padre Pio saw this process often in people who began the year with good intentions but excused small deviations, telling themselves they would correct course later, and later rarely came because habits solidified. And he urged people to correct early rather than dramatically, because early correction is gentle, while delayed correction is painful. And he taught that humility enables early correction, because it allows a person to admit misalignment without self-condemnation. And humility invites grace precisely because it does not defend error. And Padre Pio practiced this humility himself, submitting to church authority even when misunderstood, persecuted, or silenced. because he believed obedience was a form of protection, aligning the soul with God's will even when clarity was absent. And he encouraged people to cultivate this same obedience in daily life, not blindly but trustingly, accepting that God often guides through ordinary structures rather than extraordinary signs. And he warned against the desire for constant reassurance because it weakens trust, and trust is strengthened by fidelity, not by repeated confirmation. And fidelity is tested in small things, daily prayers kept when dry, moral boundaries respected when inconvenient, truth spoken when silence would be easier. And Padre Pio taught that these small fidelities accumulate into spiritual strength, forming a kind of inner armor that protects without effort, because virtue becomes habitual, and habit reduces the need for constant decision-making, freeing energy for love and service. And he emphasized that the beginning of the year is when such habits can be established intentionally rather than reactively, choosing a rhythm of prayer, work, rest, and restraint that honors God and respects human limits. And he warned against extremes, because extremes often mask pride or fear, while moderation reflects wisdom, and he believed wisdom grows through experience, guided by prayer, not through rigid plans detached from reality. And he urged people to listen to their conscience daily, examining not only actions but motivations, because motivations reveal whether the soul is oriented toward God or toward self-protection. And he taught that self-protection ultimately fails, because only surrender brings peace, and surrender does not mean passivity, but trustful action, doing what is right without demanding control over outcomes. And this trust frees the soul from anxiety about the future, allowing it to live the present faithfully, which Padre Pio considered the highest form of spiritual maturity. And he believed that a year lived this way, attentive, ordered, humble, and faithful, would not be free from suffering, but would be rich in meaning. And meaning sustains hope, and hope sustains perseverance, and perseverance leads the soul steadily toward God. And if these reflections are challenging your assumptions about how you structure your life, stay connected by subscribing, because transformation happens through repeated exposure to truth, not through one moment of inspiration. And Padre Pio's legacy was not dramatic advice, but consistent guidance toward integrity, urging people to live what they believe so that faith becomes a lived reality rather than a concept. And he trusted that when belief and life are unified, grace flows freely, protection strengthens naturally, and the soul walks forward without fear, anchored not in its own strength, but in God's faithful presence, guiding every step of the year. Padre Pio's final word on protecting the year was not a list of rules, but a call to choose truth over illusion, because he saw that most people do not lose their peace through dramatic disasters, but through quiet self-deception, convincing themselves that small compromises do not matter, that timing can be postponed, that obedience can wait. And he insisted that this mindset is what gradually closes the soul, not because God withdraws, but because the person stops listening. And he warned that the most dangerous moment is when a person still believes in God, but no longer allows God to shape decisions, because belief without obedience becomes sentiment, and sentiment cannot sustain a life when suffering arrives. And Padre Pio had seen enough suffering to know this was not theory. He had watched people cling to faith emotionally while structuring their lives around fear, control, pleasure, or approval. And when those foundations cracked, they felt abandoned, not realizing they had already drifted from reliance on God long before the crisis. And he said that the beginning of the year is when this drift can be corrected gently, before it hardens into habit, because correction early requires humility but little pain, while correction late requires suffering. And he urged people to examine their lives honestly at the threshold of the year, not to accuse themselves, but to realign, asking simple but uncomfortable questions about what truly governs their choices, what receives their best energy, what dictates their schedule, what calms their anxiety. And he taught that whatever answers those questions more than God has quietly become an idol, even if it looks harmless. and idols are rarely obvious. They are often respectable, productive, socially approved, but they demand allegiance, time, and trust that belong to God alone. And Padre Pio said that idolatry in modern life rarely looks like worship, but like dependence. And dependence reveals itself in fear of losing something: status, comfort, control, approval, distraction. And when fear dictates behavior, freedom is already compromised. And he urged people to confront fear early, because fear feeds compromise, and compromise feeds bondage, and bondage drains joy. And he reminded people that God does not want them anxious or enslaved, but free and peaceful. And freedom comes from trust, not from securing every outcome. And trust grows when a person practices surrender in small ways, choosing obedience when it costs something, choosing restraint when excess is easier, choosing prayer when distraction is tempting. And he emphasized that these choices are not heroic. They are ordinary, but their accumulation shapes a life. And he warned against the temptation to wait for ideal conditions to live faithfully, because ideal conditions rarely come. And faith practiced only when convenient is fragile, while faith practiced consistently becomes resilient. And he told people that God works with what is offered now, not with intentions deferred to later. And he urged them to sanctify the present moment, the ordinary routines, the daily responsibilities, because holiness is formed there, not in extraordinary plans. And he insisted that a year lived attentively, even imperfectly, but sincerely, would bear fruit, because grace multiplies what is offered honestly. And he cautioned against comparing one's spiritual life to others, because comparison breeds discouragement or pride, both of which distract from obedience. And he taught that each soul has a unique path, but the principles remain the same: prayer, humility, obedience, charity, and trust. And he emphasized that prayer is not merely words, but relationship, requiring time, silence, and availability. And he urged people to protect moments of silence, especially at the beginning of the year, because silence allows truth to surface, and truth reveals where change is needed. And without silence, the soul becomes numb, reacting instead of discerning. And he warned that a numb soul mistakes noise for life and busyness for purpose, and gradually forgets God, not intentionally, but practically. And he considered this forgetfulness one of the greatest dangers of modern life, because it dulls conscience without obvious rebellion. And he urged people to reclaim simplicity, not by rejecting modern life, but by ordering it, placing prayer before entertainment, conscience before convenience, truth before comfort. And he believed that such ordering would restore peace naturally, because peace is not manufactured. It emerges when life is aligned. And he reminded people that suffering does not disappear when life is aligned, but suffering becomes meaningful, and meaning transforms endurance into hope, and hope sustains perseverance, and perseverance leads the soul forward, even in darkness. And he testified through his own life that suffering, accepted with trust, deepens union with God rather than destroying it. And he warned against measuring God's presence by feelings, because feelings fluctuate, while faith endures through fidelity. And he urged people not to panic when prayer feels dry, but to remain faithful, because dryness purifies intention, teaching the soul to seek God for who he is, not for what he gives. And he said that a year lived this way would not be flashy, but it would be solid, grounded, and protected, because protection does not mean absence of trials. It means presence of grace within them. And he believed that when a person begins the year with this orientation, guarding what enters the home, the mind, and the heart, the rest of the year unfolds with greater clarity. Not because every problem disappears, but because the soul knows where to turn. And he insisted that the greatest protection is not objects, rituals, or resolutions, but coherence, living in a way that reflects what one believes, because coherence allows grace to flow without obstruction, and obstruction is what creates the sense of stagnation many people feel. And he urged anyone who felt stuck to examine not what they lacked, but what contradicted their faith in their daily choices, because removing contradiction restores movement. And he reminded people that God is patient, not easily offended, always ready to receive those who turn back sincerely. And he encouraged them not to despair over past mistakes, but to correct them now, because correction today shapes tomorrow. And he insisted that it is never too late to choose alignment, and that alignment begins with a simple decision to place God first, not symbolically, but practically, in time, priorities, and trust. And if this message resonates, stay connected and subscribe, because growth happens through consistent reminders, and Padre Pio's wisdom was not meant to impress, but to guide, pointing souls toward integrity, simplicity, and trust. And he believed that when these foundations are laid at the beginning of the year, the soul walks forward protected, not by luck or superstition, but by grace that flows freely where truth is welcomed, and that grace carries the faithful through every season, leading them steadily, quietly, and securely toward God.